66 million years ago, the sky went dark, not for a day, not for a week, for years. The asteroid that ended the dinosaurs hit with the force of roughly a billion nuclear bombs. The explosion itself was almost instant, but what came after, the ash, the cold, the silence, that lasted far longer, and it killed almost everything. When the dust finally settled, the largest animal walking the earth was no bigger than a house cat. Every forest, every ocean, every open plain, empty of the giants that had ruled them for over 160 million years. And into that emptiness, something strange happened. Life came back, but it came back wrong, or at least nothing like what you'd expect. One animal, a land creature, gradually stopped walking and moved into the ocean. Over millions of years, its legs disappeared entirely. You know its descendants today. Another creature grew massive. It couldn't fly, but it didn't need to, because it stood taller than a man and ran down its prey on two enormous legs, a bird, a predator, a nightmare. And somehow, through all of this, Antarctica was a rainforest. If you had arrived on Earth 10 million years after the extinction, you would not recognize a single large animal you saw. Not one. This is the Paleogene, the era most people have never heard of, even though it's the reason we're here. So tonight, we are going back to that world. If this is the kind of story you come here for, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Now settle in, because this is one of the wildest chapters in the history of life on Earth, and it's one almost nobody talks about. Time in this moment is measured in layers. A narrow band of pale clay threads through rock faces across the world. A line so thin it could be missed at a distance, yet so precise that it marks a boundary between two entirely different Earths. Within that layer rests an unusual concentration of iridium, an element seldom found near the surface, more common in objects that travel through space. This quiet seam is the dividing line between the vanished age of giants and the beginning of something new. Beyond it stretches the Paleogene period, a span of 66 to 23 million years ago, unfolding across 43 million years. It is arranged into three chapters: the Paleocene, the Eocene, and the Oligocene, each carrying the planet further from the world that came before. All of it sits within the Cenozoic era, the long era that continues even now, extending from that boundary layer to the present moment. The survivors that stepped across this threshold were not the dominant forms of the previous world. They were the overlooked ones. Small mammals, birds, crocodilians, turtles, lizards, along with bony fish and sharks beneath the water, persisted through conditions that erased so much else. Their advantage was not strength or size, but flexibility. Many could eat a wide range of foods, endure scarcity, or remain hidden from extremes. Most were modest in form, close to the ground, or moving through water where temperatures shifted more slowly. At the beginning of this new period, the planet itself held a different shape. The continents had not yet settled into their modern arrangement. The Atlantic Ocean was narrower, still opening. India drifted alone as an island, moving steadily northward across the equatorial seas. The Himalayas had not yet risen. Antarctica lay free of ice, its landscapes shaped by conditions far milder than those known today. The atmosphere carried far higher concentrations of carbon dioxide, holding warmth close to the surface. What remained was not only a reduced cast of life, but an absence of roles. With roughly 3/4 of species gone, the functions they once performed had vanished as well. Large herbivores that shaped vegetation were no longer present. Apex predators that once governed ecosystems had disappeared. Scavengers, grazers, specialized hunters, each niche stood open, waiting without resistance. In such a world, opportunity does not arrive gently. It spreads through every environment at once, touching land, water, and air. The survivors did not inherit a stable system, but an unfinished one. Every empty space carried potential. Every unoccupied role offered a path that had not been walked before. This period becomes defined not only by what endured, but by what was suddenly possible. Evolution, no longer constrained by established hierarchies, moved with unusual freedom. Forms that had once remained small began to expand in size and variety. Behaviors that had been peripheral became central. Entire lineages began exploring directions that would have been impossible in a crowded world. The Paleogene does not begin as a continuation, it begins as an opening, wide and uncertain, shaped by absence as much as presence. The silence left behind was not empty in the ordinary sense, but filled with unclaimed space, waiting to be occupied. From that stillness, life began to move again, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, spreading into every corner of a planet that no longer resembled its past. Light faded not as a sunset, but as a slow dimming that did not reverse. In the span of hours, the sky filled with material lifted far above weather, a suspended veil of dust, soot, and sulfur that spread across the planet. Sunlight still arrived at the top of the atmosphere, but little of it reached the ground. For an extended interval, measured in roughly 1.5 to 2 years, photosynthesis nearly ceased across most regions. Leaves could no longer convert light into growth, and the foundation of terrestrial food systems began to weaken. The first effects were quiet. Plants stopped producing new tissue, then began to wither. Seeds that would normally germinate remained dormant or failed entirely. Herbivores dependent on constant intake faced a landscape that no longer renewed itself. Their decline followed a steady course, not sudden, but relentless. Predators, tied to those herbivores, followed the same path, their numbers thinning as prey became scarce. Each link in the chain depended on the one below it, and the loss traveled upward with little resistance. Temperature shifted alongside the loss of light. With solar energy blocked, the surface cooled by an estimated 15 degrees Celsius. Regions that had once held stable warmth experienced prolonged chill. Frost extended into latitudes that rarely knew it. The air grew still in places where seasonal cycles had once moved it. Sound itself seemed altered, carried differently through denser, colder layers near the ground. In the oceans, the disturbance took another form. Carbon dioxide released by the impact and its aftermath dissolved into seawater, forming carbonic acid. The chemistry of entire basins shifted, making it more difficult for organisms that relied on calcium carbonate to maintain their shells and skeletons. Reefs weakened. Plankton communities, already disrupted by darkness, faced additional stress from the changing water. The marine world, vast and interconnected, absorbed these changes slowly but deeply. Then, over the course of several thousand years, the atmosphere began to clear. Particles settled, rains carried material back to the surface, and sunlight returned in full strength. Yet the composition of the air had changed. Elevated carbon dioxide and water vapor trapped heat, and the planet entered a period of rapid warming. Conditions moved from suppressed light and cold toward a greenhouse state, not gradually, but with a noticeable shift in direction. On land, the first widespread signs of recovery appeared in the form of ferns. Their spores, light and abundant, traveled easily across disturbed terrain. They required little to establish themselves and could grow in soils that had lost much of their complexity. Fossil records from this interval show a sharp increase in fern spores, a pattern repeated across continents. Landscapes that had been stripped of vegetation became covered in low, dense growth, a uniform green layer spreading over ash and sediment. Amid these conditions, the animals that endured shared a consistent set of traits. Small bodies required less food and allowed for quicker reproduction. Flexible diets made it possible to consume whatever resources remained, from insects to seeds to decaying matter. Many spent time below ground or within sheltered environments, reducing exposure to fluctuating temperatures. Activity patterns shifted toward the night, where conditions were more stable. Early mammals fit this pattern closely. They were not dominant, not specialized, and not conspicuous. Their survival depended on modest needs and adaptability rather than strength or speed. In burrows and hidden spaces, they persisted through a period that reshaped nearly every surface environment. When conditions stabilized enough for movement beyond shelter, these animals emerged into a world where familiar constraints had been removed. The structures that had once defined ecosystems were no longer present, and the space left behind was extensive and unclaimed. Growth did not return in a familiar shape. It spread outward in many directions at once, as if life had been released from a narrow path and allowed to explore a wider landscape of possibilities. This process, known as adaptive radiation, unfolds when entire ecological spaces are left unoccupied and the lineages that remain begin to divide, expand, and specialize at a pace far beyond ordinary evolutionary change. Without established competitors to limit variation, form and function begin to shift rapidly, testing what can persist and what cannot. The earliest mammals of the Paleocene reflect this freedom in ways that feel almost unstructured. They do not appear as simple stepping stones toward modern groups, nor as incomplete versions of familiar animals. Instead, they form a collection of experiments, each exploring a different approach to feeding, movement, and survival. Some grew larger within a few million years, while others altered their teeth, limbs, or proportions in unexpected ways. Among the first to increase in size were the condylarths, a loose grouping rather than a single lineage, united more by similarity than shared ancestry. These animals developed hooves and herbivorous teeth independently across multiple branches, reaching body sizes comparable to sheep within a relatively short span of time. Their resemblance to later hoofed mammals suggests a pattern emerging more than a direct line of descent, as different groups arrived at similar solutions under similar conditions. Pantolambda stands among these early enlargements, a mammal of modest bulk compared to later giants, yet significant for its time. Its body carried weight effectively, its limbs supporting a browsing lifestyle, but its brain remained small relative to its size. The proportions would seem unusual when compared to modern mammals, yet within its environment, this combination proved sufficient. Coryphodon followed, expanding further into aquatic margins and lowland habitats. Its form approached that of a large semi-aquatic grazer, with a body mass comparable to a hippopotamus. Despite its success, its brain-to-body ratio ranks among the lowest recorded for mammals, suggesting that cognitive complexity had not yet become a defining factor in ecological dominance. It persisted not through speed or strategy, but through steady consumption and tolerance of its surroundings. Untotherium presents a more elaborate variation. Its skull bore multiple bony protrusions, arranged in pairs along its head, while elongated canine teeth extended downward in a form more commonly associated with predators. Yet it remained herbivorous, combining features that do not align neatly with modern expectations. Its presence reflects a period when anatomical combinations were less constrained, and the boundaries between familiar categories had not yet settled. These animals belong to a broader group known as the Dinocerata, a lineage of large horned herbivores that reached considerable diversity during the Eocene before disappearing entirely. No direct descendants remain, and their forms survive only through fossil evidence, marking a complete evolutionary branch that rose and ended within this period. Alongside these herbivores, predatory roles were filled by creatures equally distinct. The mesonychids, with bodies shaped similarly to wolves, carried hooves rather than claws and possessed teeth capable of crushing bone. Their anatomy does not correspond closely with any living predator, yet for a time they occupied positions at the top of food chains, demonstrating that familiar forms are not required for ecological success. Across these lineages, a consistent pattern becomes visible. In the absence of established competition, life expands into available roles with remarkable variation, producing forms that range from functional to unusual. Many of these experiments do not persist beyond their time, yet for millions of years they define the living world, occupying spaces that later lineages will reshape in different ways. Long before mammalian predators settled into their roles, another lineage had already taken hold of the highest ground in the food chain. They did not descend from the shapes that would later define pursuit and precision among mammals. Instead, they rose from the avian line, carrying forward a body plan built for balance and speed rather than grasping limbs. In the open landscapes of South America, isolated for much of this period, these birds became the dominant hunters, shaping entire ecosystems through their presence. They are known as the forest racids, though their form is more easily understood through motion than name. Tall, upright, and built for running, they moved across the terrain with long, powerful legs that could cover ground quickly and efficiently. Their wings had reduced into structures no longer suited for flight, yet their bodies compensated with a forward-leaning posture that allowed for rapid acceleration and controlled pursuit. Among them stood Kalenken guillermoy, one of the largest known members of this lineage. Its height approached 1.8 meters, placing its head well above many of the animals it hunted. Its skull alone measured around 71 centimeters in length, a structure of bone that extended forward into a hooked beak. This skull ranks among the largest ever recorded in a bird, an indication of the scale these predators achieved. Their movement was not heavy or slow. Analysis of their leg bones suggests a capacity for speed comparable to or exceeding that of modern ostriches. Each stride carried them forward with a rhythm designed for endurance, as well as bursts of acceleration. They were able to close distance quickly, relying on forward momentum rather than stealth. The beak itself functioned as their primary tool. Unlike birds of prey that tear flesh with repeated motions, these hunters appear to have delivered rapid downward strikes. The structure of the skull supports this interpretation, indicating a capacity to absorb and deliver force along a vertical axis. Prey could be subdued through impact alone, a single precise motion, replacing the prolonged struggle seen in other predators. This dominance unfolded within a continent set apart. South America remained isolated by ocean barriers for tens of millions of years, preventing the arrival of large mammalian carnivores that were evolving elsewhere. In that separation, birds occupied a role that on other continents would be filled by mammals. The result was a landscape where feathers, rather than fur, defined the apex hunter. In distant regions, a different form of large flightless bird appeared. Gastornis, found across Europe and North America, presented a contrasting shape. Its body was robust, its legs thick, and its beak broad and powerful. For many years, it was imagined as a predator, its size suggesting a formidable presence. Yet chemical analysis of its fossilized bones has revealed a different pattern, one consistent with a plant-based diet. Its beak, though imposing, was likely used to process tough vegetation rather than flesh. The lineage of the Phorusrhacids extended far beyond the early phases of the Paleogene. They persisted through shifting climates and changing landscapes for over 60 million years, maintaining their role even as other groups rose and disappeared. Their presence remained a constant feature of their environment, adapting without losing the essential structure that defined them. Across the broader world, mammalian predators continued to develop, refining their own methods and forms. These parallel developments unfolded in separation for long periods, shaped by geography and time, each system complete within its own boundaries. Predation, in mammals, did not arrive fully formed. It assembled itself, piece by piece, across generations that carried only fragments of what would later become a refined system. Early hunters lacked the precise alignment of senses and structures seen in modern carnivores. Their eyes were not yet fully forward-facing, their claws did not retract with control, and their teeth, though capable, had not settled into the efficient slicing arrangement that would later define the role. Hunting existed, but it was still finding its shape. Among the first to occupy this role consistently were the creodonts, a diverse group that spread across continents during the Paleocene and Eocene. They were not ancestral to modern predators, but a separate path entirely, one that rose early and held dominance for an extended span. Their bodies varied, some elongated and low to the ground, others heavier and more upright, yet all shared a commitment to a diet centered on flesh. Sarcastodon represents one of the largest expressions of this lineage. Estimates place its mass at around 800 kilograms, exceeding that of a modern polar bear. Its skull carried powerful jaws lined with teeth capable of crushing bone, suggesting a feeding strategy that wasted little of a carcass. Its overall form combined features that would later be seen separately. A sturdy build paired with a gait suited for both pursuit and confrontation. Despite their success, the creodonts carried a subtle limitation within their anatomy. The teeth responsible for slicing meat, known as carnassials, were positioned further back along the jaw than in later carnivores. This placement reduced the mechanical efficiency of each bite, requiring more effort to process the same material. Over short intervals, this difference was negligible, but across millions of years, it created a gradual disadvantage. Alongside them, another group moved through similar ecological space. The mesonychids, already established as capable predators, included forms such as Andrewsarchus, known primarily from a skull measuring approximately 83 centimeters in length. It stands as the largest terrestrial mammalian predator skull recovered. Though the full body remains uncertain, the proportions suggest an animal of considerable size, likely the dominant hunter within its environment. While these larger forms held prominence, a quieter lineage developed in parallel. The maiacids, small and agile, resembled elongated weasels in form. They moved through undergrowth and along branches, occupying niches that required flexibility rather than strength. Though initially minor in presence, they carried anatomical traits that would later prove significant. Within their jaws, the carnassial teeth shifted forward, aligning more efficiently for slicing. Their limbs allowed for more precise movement, and their sensory systems began to orient in ways that improved depth perception and coordination. These changes were subtle, each offering only a slight advantage, yet they accumulated steadily over time. The transition from creodont dominance to carnivoran prevalence did not occur through sudden replacement. It unfolded gradually across tens of millions of years as small differences influenced survival and reproduction. Creodont populations declined as environmental pressures and competition favored the more efficient structure of emerging carnivorans. By the later stages of the Paleogene, the balance had shifted. The earlier hunters, once widespread, had largely disappeared, leaving behind no direct descendants. In their place, the lineage that would give rise to wolves, cats, bears, and seals continued to expand, carrying forward the refinements that had slowly assembled. Predation among mammals had taken form through persistence rather than design, shaped by incremental changes that aligned structure with function. The result was not a single invention, but a gradual convergence toward efficiency, one that would continue to evolve as conditions on Earth changed once again. There are moments in Earth's history when change moves quietly, and others when it gathers speed until the planet itself seems to shift direction. Around 56 million years ago, a vast quantity of carbon entered the atmosphere, released over a span so brief in geological terms that it appears almost sudden. Estimates suggest between 2,000 and 4,500 gigatons of carbon were added, enough to raise global temperatures by an additional 5 to 8 degrees Celsius above conditions that were already warm. The increase unfolded over roughly 20,000 years, a duration that, within deep time, passes quickly. The source of this carbon remains uncertain. One possibility lies in volcanic activity associated with the North Atlantic igneous province, where molten rock intruded into carbon-rich sediments, releasing greenhouse gases. Another involves methane hydrates stored along the ocean floor, compounds that can destabilize when warmed, releasing methane into the water and atmosphere. It is possible that one process initiated the change, while the other intensified it, creating a feedback that amplified the warming. The oceans responded first through chemistry. As carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater, it formed carbonic acid, lowering the pH of large ocean regions. This shift affected organisms that depended on carbonate ions to build shells and skeletons. In deep marine environments, existing carbonate sediments began to dissolve, leaving behind a distinct layer of reddish clay. This layer appears in sediment cores taken from ocean basins, marking the interval when dissolution outpaced deposition. On land, the effect was different. The warming did not erase ecosystems, but it altered the conditions under which they developed. Higher temperatures influenced plant growth, soil processes, and the availability of nutrients. In this environment, mammal lineages that had been gradually diversifying began to expand more rapidly. The pace of evolutionary change increased, with new forms appearing within a relatively short span. Among these were the earliest representatives of several groups that would later become familiar. Small, forest-dwelling animals with multiple toes and browsing teeth mark the beginnings of the horse lineage. Early primates, adapted for movement among branches, appear in the fossil record during this interval. At the same time, the first artiodactyls emerged, a group that would eventually include a wide range of herbivores and, through a separate path, the ancestors of whales. The warming also influenced body size. Fossil evidence shows that many mammal species became smaller during this period. Teeth recovered from deposits associated with this interval are consistently reduced in size compared to those from layers above and below. This pattern reflects physiological responses to increased temperature and changes in vegetation quality, where smaller bodies require fewer resources and dissipate heat more effectively. The duration of this event extended for approximately 200,000 years. Over that time, natural processes began to draw carbon back out of the atmosphere. Weathering of rocks consumed carbon dioxide, and ocean systems gradually absorbed and stored it. As these processes continued, temperatures declined toward earlier levels, and the planet settled into a new equilibrium. By the end of this interval, the biological landscape had shifted. Lineages that had expanded during the warming continued to diversify, carrying forward traits shaped under these conditions. The period stands not as a disruption that halted development, but as a phase that accelerated it, allowing evolutionary pathways to open more quickly than before. In its wake, the world moved into a state of sustained warmth, with ecosystems arranged under conditions that had no close parallel in later periods, a configuration that would define the character of the early Eocene. At certain intervals, the planet settles into a state that feels less like a variation and more like a different version of itself. Between roughly 53 and 50 million years ago, temperatures rose to their highest sustained levels of the past 66 million years. Global averages stood around 10 to 14 degrees Celsius above those of the present day, creating conditions that reshaped every region of the Earth. This interval, known as the early Eocene climatic optimum, formed a world defined by warmth that reached from equator to pole. The absence of permanent ice altered the character of the highest latitudes. Polar regions still experienced long periods of darkness during their seasonal cycles, yet freezing conditions did not dominate the landscape year-round. Instead, these areas supported ecosystems that would now be considered temperate or even subtropical. Fossil evidence reveals the presence of crocodilians on Ellesmere Island, far within the Arctic Circle, where modern winters bring extended darkness and temperatures that fall well below freezing. Further evidence comes from plant remains preserved in ancient sediments. Pollen grains from palm trees have been recovered from deposits in what is now Alaska, indicating that vegetation associated with warm climates once grew in regions that today support boreal forests. These findings suggest not isolated pockets of warmth, but a continuous distribution of suitable conditions across latitudes that are now sharply differentiated. This continuity allowed forests to extend across the entire globe. Dense, humid ecosystems formed an unbroken belt, linking areas that are now separated by climatic extremes. Within this connected system, animals were able to move freely across vast distances, encountering few barriers imposed by temperature. The result was a steady exchange of species between regions, contributing to an increase in biological diversity. Warmth and stability provided consistent energy input into ecosystems. Plant growth remained high, supporting a wide range of herbivores, which in turn supported predators and scavengers. Under these conditions, evolutionary change accelerated, producing a level of diversity among mammals that exceeded that of any earlier period in their history. New groups appeared, existing lineages diversified, and ecological roles multiplied. At the same time, rising temperatures influenced sea levels. With no large ice sheets to store water, the volume of the oceans expanded and coastlines shifted inland. Shallow seas spread across parts of continents, creating environments that were neither fully marine nor fully terrestrial. These transitional zones supported their own communities, adding further complexity to the global system. Across the central regions of this world lay the Tethys Ocean, a vast body of warm, shallow water stretching from what is now Western Europe to Southeast Asia. Its margins formed a network of coastal habitats where significant evolutionary transitions took place. Within these waters and along their edges, the ancestors of whales began their transformation, while early relatives of elephants moved through adjacent landscapes, both shaped by the conditions of this expansive sea. Taken together, these features describe a planet operating under a different balance. Heat was distributed more evenly, ecosystems were more interconnected, and life explored a wider range of forms within a relatively stable framework. This state persisted for millions of years, establishing patterns that would influence subsequent developments. Over time, however, the forces that maintained this balance began to shift. Continents moved, ocean pathways changed, and atmospheric conditions evolved, gradually altering the structure that had supported this widespread warmth. Along the margins where land met a shallow sea, a different kind of movement began to take shape. It did not start with fins or flukes, but with feet that pressed into damp ground, leaving impressions that led both inland and toward water. Among the mammals of this time, one lineage began to shift its center of activity, spending longer periods near shorelines, entering the water not as a final destination, but as an extension of its range. Over generations, that boundary grew less distinct. The origin of whales stands as one of the most clearly traced transformations in the fossil record, a sequence preserved with unusual continuity. Genetic evidence places their ancestry within the artiodactyls, the even-toed mammals, linking them most closely to living hippopotamuses. This connection, once unexpected, is now supported by both molecular data and skeletal features that align across millions of years. The earliest known representative of this transition is Pakicetus, dating to around 53 million years ago. Its remains have been found in what is now the arid terrain of Pakistan, though at the time of its life, this region bordered a warm coastal environment. Pakicetus moved entirely on land, its body comparable in size to a wolf, supported by limbs that ended in hooved feet. Yet within its skull, the structure of the inner ear reveals a specialization associated with underwater hearing, a feature that defines all later whales. A few million years later, Ambulocetus appears, carrying a form that reflects a more balanced existence between land and water. Its name, meaning walking whale that swam, captures this duality. It retained the ability to move across solid ground, but its limbs and spine allowed for propulsion through water using undulating motions similar to those seen in modern semi-aquatic mammals. Its feet were large and webbed, and its body elongated, suggesting a life spent partly submerged. Further along this sequence, Rhodocetus shows a shift toward a more aquatic lifestyle. Its hind limbs remained present, but were reduced in size, no longer suited for extended movement on land. The position of its nostrils began to change, migrating along the length of the skull toward a location that would eventually become the blowhole. Its body shape continued to streamline, reducing resistance in water while sacrificing efficiency on land. By around 40 million years ago, Basilosaurus represents a form fully adapted to life in the ocean. Its body stretched up to 18 meters in length, long and serpentine, moving through the water with powerful lateral motions. Though it retained small hind limbs, these structures had no functional role in locomotion, existing only as remnants of an earlier stage. Their presence serves as a physical trace of its origin, a detail carried forward even as its lifestyle had completely changed. The entire progression, from a land-dwelling mammal to a fully aquatic giant, unfolded over approximately 15 million years. Within the scale of evolutionary history, this represents a relatively rapid transformation involving coordinated changes in anatomy, physiology, and behavior. Each stage reflects a balance between old structures and new functions, gradually shifting the organism's relationship with its environment. The evidence for this sequence comes largely from regions that are now dry and distant from any coastline. Fossils of these early whales have been uncovered in Pakistan and Egypt, preserved in rock layers that were once part of the shallow margins of the Tethys Ocean. Geological uplift has since exposed these deposits, revealing a record of transformation embedded within stone, formed under entirely different conditions. From these remains, a continuous narrative emerges, one that connects terrestrial mammals with the marine forms that exist today. Every whale, dolphin, and porpoise carries within its structure the legacy of this transition, a lineage that began on land and gradually entered the sea. At the southern edge of the world, where ice now defines the horizon, there was once a landscape shaped by leaves. During the early Eocene, Antarctica supported dense forests under a climate that remained cool in seasonal rhythm, yet warm enough to sustain continuous growth. Average temperatures ranged between 12 and 16 degrees Celsius, allowing vegetation to flourish across a continent that now lies locked beneath ice. The transformation is difficult to picture from a modern perspective, yet the record preserved in rock offers a detailed account of this earlier state. On Seymour Island, just off the Antarctic Peninsula, layers of sediment contain a quiet archive of this environment. Within them are fossilized pollen grains, impressions of leaves, fragments of seed pods, and preserved wood. These remains reveal forests composed of southern beech, interwoven with ferns, podocarp conifers, and a variety of flowering plants. The structure of these communities suggests a landscape of closed canopy growth, where light filtered through overlapping layers of foliage and the ground supported a thick cover of understory vegetation. Animal life moved within these forests as well. Fossil remains of mammals, including marsupials, have been recovered from Antarctic deposits of this age. Their presence indicates that the continent was not isolated, but part of a larger connected system. At the beginning of the Paleogene, South America, Antarctica, and Australia formed a continuous landmass. Across this extended terrain, species could migrate, spreading between regions without the barriers that exist today. This connection placed Antarctica within a broader network of ecosystems, linking it to environments that are now widely separated. Movement across these continents allowed populations to expand and diversify, with lineages establishing themselves in areas that would later become inaccessible. The continent functioned not as a remote endpoint, but as a corridor through which life could pass. Over time, however, this configuration began to change. Tectonic forces gradually pulled South America away from Antarctica, opening a gap that would become the Drake Passage. This separation occurred between approximately 34 and 30 million years ago, creating a new pathway for ocean water to circulate around the southern continent. With this opening, a continuous current formed, encircling Antarctica and moving water in a closed loop. This Antarctic circumpolar current acted as a barrier, preventing warmer waters from lower latitudes from reaching the continent. Isolated from these heat sources, Antarctica began to cool. The change did not require an abrupt event, but followed from the altered flow of the ocean itself. As temperatures declined, the forests that had covered the continent began to retreat. Plant communities adapted to milder conditions could no longer sustain themselves, and their distribution contracted. In their place, colder environments took hold, allowing ice to accumulate and persist. Over a relatively short span in geological terms, the continent crossed a threshold, shifting from a vegetated landscape to one dominated by ice sheets. This transition stands as one of the most pronounced regional climate changes recorded in Earth's history. It reflects how shifts in geography can redirect currents, alter temperature distribution, and reshape entire ecosystems. The forests of Antarctica did not fade gradually over tens of millions of years, but gave way within a much narrower interval once the conditions supporting them were removed. The continent that now appears fixed and unchanging was once part of a dynamic system, its transformation tied to movements occurring across the planet. Before the open plains that would one day carry herds across the horizon, there was a small animal moving quietly through shaded ground. Hyracotherium, once called Eohippus, lived around 55 million years ago, and its form bears little resemblance to the horses known today. It stood between 30 and 60 centimeters at the shoulder, its body closer in scale to a medium-sized dog than to any modern equine. Its movement was light and measured, shaped by a landscape where dense vegetation limited distance and visibility. Its feet tell part of this story. On the front limbs, 4 toes spread outward, while the hind limbs carried 3, each ending in soft pads rather than hardened hooves. These structures allowed it to move across uneven forest floors, where stability mattered more than speed. The ground beneath it was layered with leaf litter and soft soil, environments that did not favor the concentrated impact of a single hoof. Its teeth reflect a similar adaptation. Low-crowned and suited for browsing, they process leaves, fruits, and tender plant material. At this stage, grasses had not yet become a dominant feature of terrestrial ecosystems, and there was no selective pressure for the durable, high-crowned teeth required to grind abrasive vegetation. Feeding occurred within reach, among branches and undergrowth. From this starting point, the horse lineage begins a sequence that is unusually well preserved in the fossil record. Through forms such as Orohippus, Epihippus, and later Mesohippus, gradual changes can be traced across millions of years. Each stage introduces slight adjustments in body size, limb structure, and dental complexity, forming a continuous progression rather than abrupt transformation. As environments began to shift, these anatomical changes followed. Forests, once extensive and uninterrupted, started to open in certain regions, creating spaces where movement over longer distances became advantageous. In these areas, animals with fewer toes could place their weight more directly beneath their bodies, improving efficiency and speed. The reduction in toe number did not occur as a sudden loss, but as a gradual concentration, with outer digits becoming smaller and less functional over time. The limbs lengthened, and the center of motion aligned more closely with forward movement. Teeth became higher crowned and more complex, capable of processing tougher plant material as dietary options expanded. These changes did not emerge in isolation, but in response to a landscape that was becoming less enclosed and more variable. By the end of the Paleogene, early horses had reached a size comparable to a modern sheep. They retained 3 functional toes, though the central digit had become more prominent. Their teeth showed clear adaptations toward a broader diet, reflecting a shift in available vegetation. The single hoof that defines modern horses had not yet appeared, but its development was already implied in the structure of the foot. This entire evolutionary sequence unfolded in North America. From there, horses spread to other continents through land connections that existed intermittently over geological time. Their distribution expanded, contracted, and expanded again, following the availability of pathways between land masses. Much later, they would disappear entirely from their place of origin, only to return after millions of years through human movement. The history of horses illustrates a pattern that extends beyond any single lineage. Change occurs not as a directed process, but as a response to shifting conditions. Each adaptation reflects an interaction between organism and environment, where form adjusts to function within a given context. Across this span, the small forest dweller becomes something else entirely, not through intention, but through accumulation, guided by landscapes that continue to evolve. Imagine a world where the ground is rarely visible from above. For most of the Paleogene, vegetation did not stretch outward in low, open layers, but rose upward into dense, overlapping canopies that covered vast portions of the planet. Grasses existed, but only in limited pockets, along river margins, disturbed soils, or wetland edges, never forming the sweeping plains that define many modern landscapes. Instead, forests dominated, extending across latitudes that today support open grasslands or even dry terrain. These forests were structured in tiers, with tall trees forming continuous ceilings of foliage, beneath which smaller trees, shrubs, and ground plants filled every available space. Light filtered downward in fragments, creating an environment where visibility was limited and movement required careful navigation. Air remained humid, and organic material accumulated in thick layers across the soil, shaping the conditions under which plants and animals lived. Within this setting, the form of large animals followed the structure of the environment. Herbivores did not feed by grazing across open ground, but by browsing, selecting leaves, shoots, and fruit from within reach. Their teeth were shaped accordingly, with surfaces adapted for cutting and processing softer vegetation rather than grinding abrasive grasses. Their bodies reflected the need for maneuverability rather than sustained speed, with proportions that allowed them to move between trunks and through undergrowth. The presence of continuous cover also influenced behavior. With visibility restricted, the advantage of speed diminished, as long pursuits were uncommon. Instead, survival depended on awareness within close range, on navigating complex terrain, and on exploiting resources that were distributed vertically rather than horizontally. Herd formations and migratory patterns, so common in later open environments, were less pronounced in these enclosed systems. Among the most striking inhabitants of this world were the brontotheres, a lineage of perissodactyl mammals related to horses and rhinoceroses. They reached considerable size during the Eocene, with some species approaching the mass of modern elephants. Their skulls carried paired bony structures that rose from the snout, forming broad, flattened horns whose exact function remains uncertain, possibly used in display or interaction within their own species. Their bodies were built for browsing within forested environments, with limbs that supported weight without emphasizing speed. Their feeding habits aligned with the vegetation available, and their distribution matched the extent of these forests. They represent a peak of specialization within this ecological framework, an expression of what large herbivores could become under stable, forest-dominated conditions. As the climate began to change toward the end of the Eocene, these conditions shifted. Forests contracted in response to cooling and drying trends, breaking apart into smaller, less continuous areas. The environments that had supported browsing specialists became fragmented, reducing the resources available to animals adapted to them. For the brontotheres, this transition proved decisive. Their bodies, shaped by millions of years within closed canopy systems, were not suited to the emerging landscapes. Without the vegetation structure they depended on, their populations declined rapidly, leading to complete extinction without leaving descendants. This pattern extended beyond a single group. Many animals that had thrived under forest conditions found themselves in habitats that no longer matched their adaptations. Replacement did not occur gradually, but followed the pace of environmental change, favoring forms better suited to the new structure of the land. As more open environments began to appear, The ecological framework that had defined the Paleogene started to shift. Grasses, once limited in distribution, would eventually expand, altering the relationship between animals and their surroundings in ways that would reshape the trajectory of mammalian evolution. Scale reached a point where the land itself seemed to carry a different weight. Among the largest forms to emerge was Paraceratherium, a mammal of the Oligocene whose size exceeds that of any land animal known from later times. It stood close to 4.8 meters at the shoulder, its body extending to around 7.4 meters in length, with mass estimates ranging between 15 and 20 metric tons. Its presence redefined what a terrestrial herbivore could be, moving through its environment with a height that placed its head among the upper layers of vegetation. Despite its resemblance to rhinoceroses in lineage, it lacked the defining horn of its modern relatives. Its skull extended forward without such ornamentation, and its neck lengthened to support feeding at heights unreachable to most other animals of its time. This elongation allowed it to browse from treetops, drawing parallels with much later forms that would evolve similar strategies under different conditions. The similarity reflects a recurring pattern in evolution, where unrelated groups arrive at comparable solutions when faced with similar challenges. The distribution of Paraceratherium extended across a broad region from eastern parts of Europe through Central Asia and into areas that are now within China. Fossil remains found along this corridor indicate a capacity for movement across large distances, suggesting that its populations were not confined to narrow habitats, but occupied a wide range of environments. These regions, during the Oligocene, supported woodland and shrub-dominated ecosystems, capable of sustaining animals of considerable size. Vegetation in these areas provided the necessary resources, though it was already undergoing change. The cooling trend that had begun earlier continued to influence the structure of plant communities, gradually reducing the extent of dense forest. What remained included a mix of trees and open growth, forming landscapes that could still support large browsers, but were becoming less stable over time. Within this shifting context, other large mammals developed distinctive physical features. Embolotherium, a member of the Brontothere lineage, carried a prominent structure projecting from its snout. Unlike horns formed from keratin, this projection consisted of solid bone, flattened and extended forward. Its purpose is not fully resolved, though it may have been used in interactions within the species, either for display or physical contact. Its shape and placement suggest a function tied to behavior rather than feeding. Across these large animals, a shared pattern emerges. Increased body size, combined with specialized structures, reflects a period when ecological roles allowed for such expansion. Abundant vegetation and relatively stable conditions supported growth, while competition remained structured in ways that permitted these forms to persist. At the same time, the scale carried inherent limitations. Large bodies require substantial and consistent resources, and specialized features often align closely with specific environmental conditions. As those conditions began to shift, the advantages that had once supported these animals became constraints. The cooling climate of the Oligocene gradually altered the distribution of vegetation, reducing the availability of the habitats that sustained these large herbivores. Forested regions contracted, and the balance between different plant types shifted, influencing the entire food network. For animals dependent on particular forms of vegetation, these changes reduced both the quantity and reliability of resources. In this context, the presence of Paraceratherium and its contemporaries represents both an expansion of possibility and a moment of vulnerability. Their size and structure illustrate what can develop under favorable conditions, while their eventual disappearance reflects the sensitivity of such forms to environmental change. The landscapes that supported them did not remain constant, and as they transformed, so too did the animals that could inhabit them. Far from the shifting connections of other land masses, one continent moved through this era in quiet separation. For tens of millions of years during the Paleogene, South America remained surrounded by open ocean, its boundaries defined by distance rather than climate. To the north, waters prevented contact with North America, while to the east, the widening South Atlantic maintained its distance from Africa. This isolation created a setting in which life developed without the continual exchange of species that shaped other regions. Within this enclosed system, evolution followed its own course. Mammals diversified in ways that reflected available ecological roles rather than inherited templates from elsewhere. The result was a collection of forms that often resembled animals on other continents, yet arose independently, shaped by similar pressures rather than shared ancestry. Among these were the notungulates, a broad and varied group of hoofed herbivores unique to South America. Across this lineage, body plans emerged that echoed the shapes of horses, rhinoceroses, and smaller grazing animals, despite having no direct relationship to those groups. Their limbs, teeth, and proportions adapted to the environments they occupied, filling roles that elsewhere would be taken by entirely different lineages. Macrauchenia stands as one of the more distinctive members of this group. Roughly the size of a camel, it carried 3-toed feet and a neck that supported a small, flexible trunk. Its appearance combined elements that, when first discovered, did not align with any known category. Fossils collected in Argentina during early explorations presented a form that resisted classification, reflecting how far this isolated evolution had diverged from more familiar patterns. Another example, Toxodon, carried a heavier body and a skull whose structure blended features in unusual ways. Its teeth suggested grinding and browsing, yet their arrangement did not match that of typical herbivores. Early descriptions noted similarities to several unrelated groups, an indication that its anatomy had developed along a path distinct from the standard divisions recognized at the time. Predation within this system followed a similar pattern of independent development. Marsupials, which declined in prominence elsewhere, expanded into carnivorous roles in South America. Thylacosmolus represents one of the most striking examples, bearing elongated upper canines that resemble those of later saber-toothed cats. Despite this similarity, its structure and lineage are entirely separate, a case where similar ecological demands produced comparable solutions in different evolutionary contexts. Rodents also reach sizes far beyond what is typical today. Joseph-Ortegacia monesi, known from later deposits, approached a mass of around 1,000 kilograms. Its presence reflects a continuation of patterns established during the Paleogene, where isolation allowed lineages to expand into roles that might otherwise have been occupied by different groups. The origin of some of these mammals presents its own layer of complexity. Evidence suggests that certain placental groups reach South America not through continuous land connections, but by crossing open water. The most widely accepted explanation involves dispersal on floating vegetation, carried by currents over distances that, while improbable, are supported by the distribution of fossils. These rare events introduced new lineages into an otherwise closed system, where they would then diversify in isolation. Across this continent, evolution unfolded without direct competition from many of the groups present elsewhere. The forms that emerged reflect both the possibilities and the constraints of such separation, producing a landscape populated by animals that mirror familiar roles while remaining entirely distinct in their origins. Across a belt of water that once divided continents, the surface remained calm while the ground beneath it moved. The Tethys Ocean extended for vast distances, linking regions that are now separated by land and time. It reached from what is now Western Europe across to Southeast Asia, a broad expanse of warm, often shallow water that supported an immense variety of life. Its margins formed a setting where major evolutionary pathways unfolded, providing conditions that shaped the early histories of whales, the ancestors of elephants, and many other lineages. During the Paleogene, this ocean did not vanish through sudden change, but through a gradual narrowing driven by the movement of continents. Africa shifted northward, and the Indian landmass, once separated by open water, continued its steady movement toward Eurasia. These motions, occurring over millions of years, reduced the width of the Tethys from both directions, compressing the space it occupied. The most significant of these interactions began around 50 million years ago when India made contact with Asia. Before this moment, no Himalayan range existed. The collision between these two landmasses initiated a process of uplift where the crust thickened and rose, forming mountains that continue to grow even now. The rate of this uplift, measured in millimeters per year, appears slight, yet over geological time it produces structures of immense scale. As the mountains rose, their influence extended far beyond their immediate location. Elevated terrain altered the flow of air across the planet, redirecting wind patterns and contributing to the formation of large-scale seasonal systems, including the monsoon circulation over South Asia. These changes influenced precipitation, temperature distribution, and the movement of heat across regions. At the same time, the reconfiguration of land and sea affected ocean currents. Pathways that had once allowed water to move freely were interrupted or redirected, altering the transfer of heat within the oceans. These shifts contributed to a broader cooling trend that became more pronounced through the later stages of the Eocene and into the Oligocene. What remains of the Tethys today exists as a series of separated bodies of water. The Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Aral Sea represent fragments of a once continuous system. Each occupies a basin that traces back to the larger ocean, their isolation reflecting the progression of continental movement that closed the connections between them. Evidence of this transformation is also found in places far removed from any present shoreline. Marine fossils embedded within rocks now lie at high elevations within the Himalayas. These remains, formed in ancient seabeds, were carried upward as the land rose, placing shells of ocean-dwelling organisms among the highest points on Earth. Their presence records the history of a sea that no longer exists in its original form. As the Tethys narrowed and eventually fragmented, new land connections emerged while others disappeared. These changes altered the routes available for species to move between regions, creating opportunities for migration in some areas and barriers in others. The resulting exchanges brought new interactions where previously separated populations encountered one another, leading to both diversification and extinction. Each of these shifts, whether in land position, ocean flow, or atmospheric pattern, carried consequences that extended through multiple layers of the planet's systems. Geological movement influenced climate, climate influenced ecosystems, and ecosystems shaped the direction of evolution. The closing of the Tethys reflects this interconnected process where changes in the physical structure of Earth set in motion a sequence of transformations that reached into every aspect of the living world. Somewhere above the forest floor, In air that had long belonged only to insects, a new form of movement appeared. It did not glide in hesitation or fall in arcs between branches, but moved with sustained control, powered by muscles that drove flexible wings through repeated strokes. Among mammals, this ability stands alone. True flight, continuous and self-propelled, emerged within this lineage during the Eocene, yet its beginnings remain among the least clearly documented transitions in vertebrate history. The earliest known example, Onychonycterus finii, comes from deposits in what is now Wyoming, dated to roughly 52 million years ago. Its skeleton reveals wings already capable of powered flight, with elongated fingers supporting a thin membrane stretched between limbs. The proportions of its body indicate an animal fully adapted to aerial movement. At the same time, its inner ear lacks the specialized structures associated with advanced echolocation, suggesting that its navigation relied primarily on vision and perhaps simpler auditory cues. This detail altered a long-held assumption. It had been thought that echolocation, the ability to perceive surroundings through reflected sound, developed alongside or even before flight. Onychonycterus indicates a different sequence, where flight appeared first, and the refinement of acoustic navigation followed later. The order of these adaptations changes how the early behavior of bats is understood, placing visual orientation at the foundation of their initial expansion into the air. The broader problem lies in what is not present. Bats appear in the fossil record with wings already formed, without a clear series of transitional stages leading up to them. Their potential ancestors, if they existed in earlier forms, have left little trace. This absence may reflect the fragility of small, lightweight bones, which are less likely to preserve under typical conditions. It may also indicate that the transformation occurred relatively quickly within environments that did not favor fossilization. The pathway to flight remains uncertain. One possibility begins in the canopy, where small mammals may have moved between branches by gliding, gradually extending the surface area of their limbs until flapping flight became possible. Another considers ground-based origins, where running and leaping insectivores developed the ability to generate lift through increasingly coordinated movements. Both scenarios align with aspects of bat anatomy, yet neither is fully supported by direct fossil evidence. What can be observed is the environment into which these animals emerged. Forests of the Eocene supported vast numbers of insects, forming a resource that remained largely unexploited during the night. In this dim interval between sunset and sunrise, a new niche existed, defined by airborne prey and minimal competition. Bats entered this space, their flight allowing them to access insects beyond the reach of ground-dwelling hunters. Echolocation, which developed after flight in at least some lineages, added a further dimension to this adaptation. By emitting high-frequency sounds and interpreting the returning echoes, bats constructed a detailed perception of their surroundings. This system allowed them to detect small, moving targets and navigate through complex environments without reliance on light. The ability evolved independently in multiple bat groups, reflecting a repeated solution to the challenges of nocturnal flight. From these beginnings, bats expanded into a wide range of forms, occupying roles that extend across many habitats. Today, they represent a significant portion of mammalian diversity, a result of an early transition that opened access to a previously unused domain. Their origin remains partially hidden, yet their presence marks a clear expansion of what mammals could become, extending their reach into the air above the forest canopy. In the layered stillness of ancient forests, among branches that filtered light into shifting patterns, a particular way of moving began to take shape. It belonged to small bodies that did not simply climb, but reached, grasped, and balanced with a precision that hinted at something quietly different. The order that would come to include lemurs, monkeys, apes, and eventually humans traces its origins deep into the Paleogene, with the Eocene serving as the interval when its defining form settled into place. At the edge of that story stands Purgatorius, a creature no larger than a shrew, known from fragments dated to roughly 66 million years ago. Its teeth and ankle structure suggest an animal adapted for life in trees, capable of navigating branches while feeding on a varied diet. Its classification remains uncertain, balanced between early primate and close relative, yet it occupies a position near the base of a lineage that would expand in complexity over time. As the Eocene unfolded, a consistent set of traits emerged across these early primates. Eyes shifted forward on the skull, creating overlapping fields of vision that allowed for precise depth perception among branches. Hands and feet developed grasping ability, with flat nails replacing claws, increasing tactile sensitivity and control. Brain size, relative to body mass, began to expand, supporting more flexible behavior. Diet remained broad, including insects, fruit, and leaves, allowing these animals to adjust to the varied resources of forest environments. One of the most detailed glimpses into this world comes from Darwinius massillae, a specimen preserved in remarkable completeness from deposits in what is now Germany, dated to approximately 47 million years ago. The outlines of its body remain visible, along with the contents of its final meal, composed of fruit, seeds, and leaves. Its anatomy reflects an arboreal life, with limbs suited for grasping and movement along branches. Early interpretations proposed it as a direct ancestor to humans, though further study placed it within the lemur lineage, illustrating how preservation can illuminate form without necessarily revealing direct relationships. By the middle of the Eocene, primates had separated into two major branches. One group, the strepsirrhines, includes lemurs, lorises, and bush babies, characterized by certain features of the nose and sensory systems. The other, the haplorhines, encompasses tarsiers, monkeys, apes, and humans, marked by different visual and neurological traits. This divergence established the primary framework that continues into the present, with each lineage exploring its own variations within shared constraints. Within the haplorhine branch, early anthropoids began to appear in the fossil records of Asia and Africa during the Middle to Late Eocene. These forms represent the beginning of the lineage that would later give rise to monkeys and apes. Their presence across multiple regions suggests movement between land masses that were then separated by shallow seas, a process that remains an area of ongoing study. The details of their dispersal are incomplete, yet their existence in these regions marks an expansion beyond their initial habitats. Throughout this period, the primate story unfolds without dramatic shifts or sudden dominance. It is a gradual gathering of characteristics, each adjustment building upon the last, shaped by the demands of life among branches and the opportunities provided by a warm, forested world. Small changes in vision, grip, and cognition accumulate, forming a foundation that supports increasing complexity over time. What emerges is not a single defining moment, but a quiet sequence of refinements extending across millions of years, assembling the structure of a lineage that would one day turn its attention backward, tracing its own beginnings through fragments preserved in stone. A quiet lake once lay within a circular hollow, its surface smooth, its depths strangely still, holding within them a record far more detailed than stone usually allows. This place is now known as the Messel Pit in what is today Germany. A deposit formed around 47 million years ago within the crater of a volcanic explosion. It was a maar lake, steep-sided and enclosed, where the lower waters lacked oxygen and movement. Organisms that slipped beneath the surface did not decay in the usual way. Instead, they settled into fine sediments, their forms preserved with a precision that approaches the living moment from which they came. Within these layers, entire bodies remain articulated, not scattered or distorted. Fur outlines linger as faint shadows, feathers hold their structure, and even the contents of stomachs can be traced. What emerges is not a list of species, but a living system, observed in fragments that still carry the texture of their final hours. Among the most revealing are the small horses known as Eurohippus messelensis. Their bodies are delicate, their limbs adapted for moving through forested terrain, yet it is their interiors that speak most clearly. Fossilized gut contents show leaves, fruits, and even grapes, preserved in such detail that their shapes remain recognizable. This is not inference drawn from tooth structure, but direct evidence of diet, a record of feeding behavior from a distant age. One specimen carries an even more intimate detail. A female lies with the faint outline of a fetus within her ribcage, its bones positioned where life had not yet begun outside the body. Surrounding tissues have left impressions that indicate the presence of a uterus, offering a rare glimpse into reproduction. It stands as the only known example from this time where such anatomy has been preserved, a moment of development held in stillness. Elsewhere, in the same deposits, bats appear with their wing membranes extended, the delicate structures intact enough to reveal how they stretched between elongated fingers. In several cases, fragments of insects rest within their stomachs, the final act of feeding recorded alongside the form of the hunter. These remains connect movement, diet, and anatomy into a single frame. Predation is also present, captured without motion, yet unmistakable in its sequence. A crocodilian lies with a turtle inside its body cavity, both preserved together. The relationship between predator and prey, usually inferred from scattered remains, is here contained within one specimen, a complete interaction held in 3 dimensions. The diversity extends outward in every direction. Early primates, including the individual once called Ida, appear alongside early pangolins and relatives of anteaters, each carrying traces of their ecological roles. Tapir-like animals move through the same environment. Birds of varied forms occupy the air and water, and fish fill the lake itself, many preserved with scales and soft tissues intact. Across thousands of layers, each representing a separate moment of deposition, these scenes accumulate. The repetition does not diminish their clarity, but deepens it, allowing patterns to emerge from individual instances. Diets, interactions, and life histories align into a broader understanding of how this Eocene ecosystem functioned. The Messel Pit offers something rarely achieved in the geological record, a view not only of who was present, but of how they lived within a shared environment. It is a collection of moments, each preserved with unusual fidelity, forming a continuous portrait of life in a world long vanished yet still quietly present within the stone. At first, the lineage that would one day carry immense weight across open landscapes existed in a form so small it could have moved unnoticed beneath low vegetation, its presence marked only by faint impressions in soft ground. In the late Paleocene of what is now Morocco, around 55 to 56 million years ago, Erytherium azuzorum lived as a modest creature, roughly the size of a small dog. Its body held none of the features commonly associated with elephants. There was no trunk, no tusks, no towering frame. Only in the subtle structure of its teeth and skull can its connection to later giants be traced, delicate clues embedded in enamel and bone. Close to it in time and place, Phosphatherium esquiliae appears in the fossil record, similarly small and similarly unassuming. Together, these early forms establish Africa as the origin point of the entire Proboscidean lineage. Within that continent, separated by oceans from other landmasses, a quiet sequence of transformations began to unfold. By the Eocene, the lineage had already shifted in form. Mortherium emerges as a pig-sized animal, inhabiting environments that suggest a partial association with water. Its limbs and body proportions indicate a lifestyle that may have included wading or swimming, and its skull hints at a flexible upper lip. This structure was not yet a trunk, but it carried the potential for one, a muscular extension capable of grasping or guiding food toward the mouth. As time progressed into the Oligocene, the changes became more pronounced. Phyomia appears with a body approaching the size of a modern tapir, its proportions more robust, its feeding structures more specialized. A short but functional proboscis had formed, no longer just a suggestion, but a working extension of the face. Small tusks appeared in both the upper and lower jaws, giving the animal new ways to manipulate vegetation and interact with its surroundings. During this period, the lineage did not move toward a single fixed design. Instead, it branched into multiple variations, each exploring different configurations of trunk and tusk. Some forms developed downward curving lower tusks, others broad, flattened structures that could have been used to scrape or shovel plant material. In certain lineages, upper and lower tusks crossed or diverged in unusual ways, creating feeding tools unlike anything seen in later elephants. Each variation corresponded to a particular ecological role, a response to specific conditions within the environments they occupied. Africa's long isolation during much of the Paleogene provided a setting in which these experiments could proceed with limited external competition. Within this space, the Proboscideans diversified, adapting to forests, wetlands, and transitional landscapes. Their increasing size allowed access to different food sources, while their evolving facial structures expanded the ways in which those resources could be gathered and processed. Gradually, this lineage began to extend beyond its point of origin. By the end of the Paleogene, Proboscideans had dispersed into Eurasia, carrying with them the accumulated innovations of millions of years. The transformation from small, generalized mammals into large, specialized herbivores had not occurred in a single leap, but through a series of measured steps, each grounded in immediate survival rather than distant outcome. The animals that would later define entire ecosystems began here, in forms that bore only the faintest resemblance to their descendants. Over time, those faint traces expanded into a body plan capable of shaping landscapes, a presence that would become one of the most influential among large terrestrial mammals, rooted in origins that remained small, quiet, and easily overlooked. Far from the cooling continents, the oceans entered a phase of quiet construction, shaping bodies and behaviors that would come to define life in open water. During the Oligocene, a transformation unfolded within the lineage of whales that had only recently committed fully to the sea. The earlier archaeocetes, elongated and serpentine, gave way to two distinct paths that would persist into the present. From a common ancestor emerged the baleen whales and the toothed whales, each adapting to a different way of feeding and navigating the vastness around them. In the early stages of this split, the boundary between these forms was not yet fixed. Fossils from regions that are now New Zealand and Antarctica preserve whales that carried both teeth and the beginnings of baleen. Their jaws show reduced dentition alongside structures that would later support filtering plates, indicating a gradual shift from grasping prey to straining small organisms from the water. This transition is recorded step by step, revealing a change not only in anatomy, but in the entire scale of feeding strategy. Among the toothed whales, new capabilities emerged that transformed how predators could move through their environment. Squalodon appears with teeth that resemble those of sharks, serrated and suited for gripping active prey. Its skull shows evidence of early echolocation, a system that allowed it to emit sound and interpret returning echoes, building a three-dimensional sense of its surroundings. In the dim and often opaque waters of the ocean, this ability provided a way to detect movement and shape without reliance on sight alone. While whales were refining their place in the water, another lineage approached the same environment from a different direction. The ancestors of seals, sea lions, and walruses began as terrestrial carnivorans, gradually extending their time in aquatic settings. Their bodies adapted for swimming, with limbs reshaped into flippers and streamlined forms that reduced resistance. Yet unlike whales, they retained a connection to land, returning to shorelines for reproduction. This partial transition created a group that bridged two worlds, neither fully terrestrial nor entirely marine. The seas themselves supported these changes through shifts in circulation and nutrient flow. As global patterns of water movement became more defined, driven by the isolation of polar regions and the rearrangement of ocean basins, currents began to bring nutrients from the depths to the surface. These upwellings sustained large populations of plankton and small organisms, forming the base of expansive food webs. In such environments, both filter feeders and active predators found abundant resources. Sharks also moved toward larger forms during this time. The ancestors of what would later become Otodus megalodon were already present, their bodies increasing in size compared to earlier relatives. These sharks occupied high positions within the marine hierarchy, their growth supported by the same productivity that sustained whales and other large animals. Their teeth, preserved in sediments, reflect a capacity for handling substantial prey, marking the early stages of a lineage that would later reach extraordinary dimensions. Across these oceans, size and specialization expanded together. The availability of food allowed for the evolution of large bodies, while the demands of movement and hunting shaped new anatomical solutions. Some animals filtered immense volumes of water, others pursued prey with precision guided by sound, and still others moved between land and sea, maintaining a dual existence. The Oligocene ocean did not yet mirror the modern arrangement, but its essential structures were taking form. Within its currents and along its margins, a community of large, complex organisms emerged, each adapting to the opportunities provided by a changing planet, assembling a marine world that would continue to evolve long after this interval had passed. There comes a point in deep time when change is no longer gradual, when the balance shifts and does not return to its previous state. Around 34 million years ago, at the boundary between the Eocene and Oligocene, Earth crossed such a threshold. Temperatures declined across the planet, not in a brief fluctuation but in a sustained transition that altered the structure of climate itself. Over Antarctica, ice sheets began to form and persist, locking vast amounts of water away from the oceans. As this ice accumulated, global sea levels fell, exposing new stretches of land that had long been submerged. This shift reshaped continents and climates together. Winds and ocean currents adjusted to new temperature gradients, and seasonal patterns became more pronounced. Regions that had once supported continuous warmth experienced greater variation, with cooler intervals and less stable rainfall. The world did not become cold in an absolute sense, but it became less uniform, more divided by latitude and season. In Europe, this transformation is marked by a sudden change in the fossil record known as the Grande Coupure, the Great Break. Species that had evolved in relative isolation disappeared in a short span of geological time. Their place was taken by animals arriving from Asia, crossing newly available land routes created as sea levels dropped. This was not a gradual blending of faunas, but a rapid replacement, a reorganization of entire communities. Among those that vanished were the brontosaurs, large herbivores with elaborate paired structures on their skulls. These animals had thrived in environments where dense vegetation provided consistent food and shelter. As forests contracted and conditions became more variable, their specialized forms no longer matched the landscape. They disappear from the record at or near this boundary, leaving no direct descendants. Predatory lineages were also affected. The creodonts, which had once dominated carnivorous niches, were already under pressure from emerging competitors. The environmental changes of this period further reduced their foothold, and most of their diversity faded during this transition. A few lineages persisted for a time, but their long dominance had ended. Primates in Europe followed a similar pattern. Many of the earlier forms, adapted to warm and stable forest conditions, could not maintain their presence as temperatures declined. Their distribution retreated toward regions that remained more consistently warm, particularly parts of Africa and Asia, where suitable habitats continued to exist. Vegetation itself reorganized in response to the cooling. Tropical forests withdrew toward equatorial regions, replaced in mid-latitudes by more seasonal woodlands. These new environments experienced cycles of growth and dormancy, shaping the kinds of plants that could persist. At the margins, more open habitats began to appear, areas where continuous canopy gave way to scattered vegetation and exposed ground. Animals that succeeded in this new world tended to share certain qualities. They were capable of feeding on a wider range of resources, able to adjust their diets as conditions shifted. Their bodies supported movement across more varied terrain, and their physiology allowed them to cope with fluctuations in temperature and water availability. These traits did not guarantee survival in every case, but they provided resilience in a landscape that no longer offered stability. By the end of the Oligocene, around 23 million years ago, the planet had settled into a configuration more familiar in its broad outlines. Ice remained at the poles, climates varied more distinctly with latitude, and the distribution of ecosystems began to resemble patterns that would persist into later periods. The animals present were not the same as those alive today, yet their forms and relationships hinted at lineages that would continue forward, shaped by a world that had become cooler, drier, and more changeable. Beneath every reconstruction of ancient life lies a quieter truth, one that does not appear in the skeletons themselves, but surrounds them, shaping what can be known and what remains forever absent. The fossil record, from which every detail of this story has been drawn, is not a complete archive. It is a collection assembled through rare and unlikely events, each specimen the result of a sequence that must unfold with precision. An organism must die in a place where burial can occur quickly before scavengers scatter or consume the remains. Sediment must settle and seal it away, and chemical conditions must allow minerals to replace or preserve the original structures. Across millions of years, that buried form must endure pressure, heat, and the shifting of the crust, then return to the surface through uplift and erosion, finally encountering a human observer at just the right moment. Because of this, absence within the record does not equate to absence in life. Many species left no trace at all. Their existence carried only in the continuity of those that followed. Even for those that are preserved, the record often captures only fragments, a tooth here, a bone there, separated from the full context of the living organism. This incompleteness produces patterns that must be interpreted with care. The Signor Lips effect describes how the last appearance of a species in the fossil record almost always precedes its true extinction. The final individuals often leave no remains that survive to the present, so extinctions appear gradual when they may have been abrupt. What seems like a slow fading can in reality be a sharper ending, softened by the gaps in preservation. There are also lineages inferred rather than observed, known as ghost lineages. Studies of living species, using genetic differences to estimate divergence times, often suggest that entire branches of evolution existed long before their earliest known fossils. These missing intervals represent histories that unfolded without leaving a physical trace accessible to us, stretches of time filled with organisms that have vanished without record. The distribution of fossils across the planet adds another layer of imbalance. Much of what is known from the Paleogene comes from regions where conditions favored preservation and where exploration has been sustained, particularly parts of North America, Western Europe, and Central Asia. Other areas, including large portions of Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, and the deep ocean floor, remain comparatively underrepresented. Each new discovery from these regions has the potential to alter established patterns, not by contradicting them, but by adding dimensions that were previously unseen. Even now, the outline continues to evolve. In recent years, new whale species have been described from sediments in Egypt, expanding the understanding of early marine adaptations. In another part of the world, giant penguins have been identified in deposits from New Zealand, revealing forms larger and more varied than once imagined. These findings do not complete the picture, but they refine its contours. Advances in technology are extending the reach of what can be learned from existing material. Microcomputed tomography allows researchers to examine internal structures without damaging the fossil, revealing details of growth and function. Chemical analyses of preserved proteins can establish relationships between species that are too ancient for DNA to survive. Isotopic signatures within bones and teeth offer insights into diet, temperature regulation, and patterns of movement, translating silent remains into traces of behavior. What emerges from all of this is a record that is both remarkable and partial. It offers windows into moments long past, yet between those windows stretches a vast expanse of unrecorded time. The story that can be told is detailed in places, faint in others, and shaped as much by what is missing as by what has been found. Between the bones and leaves preserved in stone, there exists another layer of life, smaller in scale, yet far more numerous, a network of forms that rarely draws attention, yet quietly sustains everything above it. Within the deposits of the Messel Pit, this hidden world appears with unusual clarity. Insects, so often absent or fragmented in the fossil record, are preserved here with structures delicate enough to reveal the patterns of their wings and the textures of their bodies. Among them are ants captured in their reproductive forms, with wings extended and veins still visible. These individuals, queens and males, indicate the presence of organized colonies, societies already structured with division of roles and coordinated behavior 47 million years ago. Other insects retain features that go beyond shape. Beetles from these layers preserve traces of their original coloration, not as pigment, but as structural color produced by microscopic arrangements on their outer surfaces. The iridescence, once part of their living appearance, reflects a complexity in design that interacts with light itself. Such preservation provides evidence that visual signaling and surface patterning were already part of insect life at this time. Beyond Messel, the Paleogene record reveals forms that expand the sense of scale within this smaller world. Titanomyrma lubae, discovered in deposits from what is now Wyoming, represents an ant of remarkable size, with wings extending to roughly 15 centimeters. Its proportions approach those of a modern hummingbird, suggesting environmental conditions capable of supporting such large-bodied insects. Warm temperatures and abundant resources allowed these forms to exist in ways that are less common in cooler periods. The relationship between insects and plants also appears in these records with increasing detail. Fossil butterflies and moths from the Eocene show structures associated with feeding on nectar, while the plants of the same deposits display features suited for pollination. This indicates that the interaction between flowering plants and their insect partners had already developed into a complex exchange, each influencing the evolution of the other. Shapes, scents, and feeding mechanisms aligned over long spans of time, creating systems of mutual dependence. In such environments, diversity extended not only across visible forms, but into countless ecological roles. Insects occupied positions as pollinators, decomposers, predators, and prey, linking the flow of energy from plant life to larger animals. The stability and warmth of Paleogene forests supported a wide range of niches, allowing specialization and variation to expand. Many of these roles have parallels today, though the exact forms that filled them have often changed. This underlying network supported every larger organism that moved through these ecosystems. The diets of herbivores depended on plants, shaped in part by insect activity, while carnivores relied on prey whose own survival was tied to these smaller interactions. Even the processes of decay and nutrient cycling, essential for sustaining plant growth, were carried out largely by organisms too small to leave a consistent fossil record. What remains visible, the bones of large animals and the outlines of leaves, represents only part of the system. Beneath and between those preserved elements lies a dense web of activity that made those larger lives possible. The insects of the Messel Pit offer a glimpse into that layer, revealing a world of structure and interaction that, though often overlooked, forms the foundation upon which all other stories in this landscape depend. Patterns begin to repeat themselves when viewed across enough time, not as echoes of shared ancestry, but as independent answers arriving at the same place through different paths. Across the Paleogene, this repetition appears again and again, shaped not by coincidence but by the quiet boundaries set by physics and form. Separate lineages, unaware of each other, encounter similar challenges and arrive at solutions that look strikingly alike. This process, known as convergent evolution, unfolds as a kind of natural alignment between possibility and necessity, where certain designs emerge because they work within the limits of muscle, bone, and motion. Among the most vivid examples are saber teeth, elongated upper canines that evolved in multiple groups that share no close relationship. Nimravids, early relatives of modern carnivores, developed them in one branch. Later, true cats known as mecharodonts refined the same structure with their own anatomy. In South America, the marsupial Thylacosmolus arrived at a nearly identical form, while the Creodont Macharoides produced its own variation. Each lineage constructed these blades through different developmental pathways, yet the end result served a similar purpose, a precise tool for subduing large prey with controlled force. A comparable pattern appears among animals that extended their faces into flexible feeding tools. Elephants, with their muscular trunks, represent one version of this design. Elsewhere, Macraucania, a South American herbivore with no close modern relatives, evolved a shortened trunk of its own. Tapirs developed a similar structure, as did certain Oligocene chalicothers. In each case, the elongation of the nose allowed access to vegetation beyond immediate reach, transforming the head into a functional extension of the body's feeding range. In open landscapes and forest edges, the role of large terrestrial predator was sometimes filled not by mammals, but by birds. In South America, terror birds grew into swift, ground-based hunters. In distant regions, Gastornis occupied a comparable position, though with a different diet. Later, in Australia, the Mihirungs formed another version of this pattern. These birds, separated by geography and ancestry, each explored the same structural idea, a large, flightless body adapted for dominance on land. The sensing of unseen surroundings also followed multiple independent paths. Bats developed echolocation, emitting high-frequency calls and interpreting returning echoes to navigate and hunt in darkness. Within that group, the ability appears to have arisen more than once. In the oceans, toothed whales evolved a parallel system, using sound to map their environment through water. Even among smaller mammals, such as certain shrews and tenrecs, variations of this acoustic perception emerged. Each instance assembled a similar capability from different anatomical starting points, guided by the same constraints of sound and space. What becomes visible through these repeated patterns is a deeper structure underlying evolution itself. The range of viable solutions is not unlimited. Materials have properties, forces have limits, and movement follows rules that cannot be ignored. Within those boundaries, certain arrangements of form and function prove consistently effective. Evolution, working through variation and selection, discovers these arrangements again and again, as if tracing familiar routes through a landscape defined by possibility. Across millions of years, this quiet repetition shapes the living world into a collection of recurring ideas, expressed through different bodies. The details vary, the lineages diverge, yet the underlying forms return, refined and rediscovered, wherever similar challenges arise. The long interval closes not with a single event, but with a quiet alignment of systems that had been shifting for tens of millions of years, settling into a configuration that begins to feel familiar. By 23 million years ago, the closing of the Oligocene marks the end of the Paleogene, a span of 43 million years that reshaped life from its foundations. Many of the early experiments that once dominated have already faded from the record. The Dinosaurata with their heavy skulls and unusual ornamentation, the varied condylarths that first explored large herbivore roles, the creodont predators that once held the balance of power, and the brontothers that filled forest clearings with their immense bodies, all belong to a past that has quietly withdrawn. In their place, A different set of lineages has taken hold, not more dramatic in form, but more enduring in structure. Across the continents, the ancestors of modern groups are now clearly present. Early horses move with limbs already adapting to firmer ground, their bodies beginning to reflect a future not yet fully realized. Rhinoceros, relatives, and tapirs browse through thinning forests, while the earliest members of deer, pigs, and camels establish themselves within shifting habitats. In the oceans, whale lineages continue their divergence, refining forms that will persist into the present. Elephants, still far from their later scale, carry the beginnings of a body plan that will expand across continents. Bats remain in the night air, already successful in their chosen niche, while primate lineages continue their quiet development in regions where warmth still allows their survival. The surface of the planet reflects this transition in its geography. The Atlantic Ocean has widened further, its separation shaping climate and circulation. The Himalayas continue to rise, their elevation altering wind patterns and rainfall across vast regions. The remnants of the Tethys have narrowed into disconnected seas, their once continuous expanse reduced to fragments that hint at a broader past. Land bridges appear and disappear with changes in sea level, allowing movement in some directions while closing others. At the poles, cold has taken hold in a lasting way. Antarctica carries ice that persists through the seasons, establishing a new baseline for global climate. Yet the world has not reached the extremes that will come later. The deep glaciations of the distant future have not yet begun, and much of the planet remains warmer than what would later be considered typical. There are also absences that define this moment as clearly as any presence. Open grassland savannas have not yet spread across continents, and the animals that depend on them have not yet emerged in their recognizable forms. The largest marine predators of later ages have not reached their full expression. Coral reef systems, as they will eventually appear, are still assembling their modern structures. Among primates, the lineages that will one day produce great apes and eventually humans remain in earlier stages, their future potential still unexpressed. Taken together, the Paleogene can be seen as a prolonged phase of construction, a time in which ecological roles were emptied, refilled, tested, and refined. Structures that proved stable persisted, while others, no matter how successful for a time, disappeared when conditions shifted beyond their limits. What remains at its end is not a finished world, but a framework, an arrangement of climates, continents, and living forms that will support everything that follows. Within that framework lies a quiet continuity, a sense that the processes shaping life have carried forward into the present. The patterns observed across these millions of years remain active, still guiding change, still responding to the same constraints and opportunities. The world at the end of the Paleogene is not identical to the one that exists now, yet it is close enough that its outlines can be recognized, as though a distant landscape has come gradually into focus. Imagine a single calendar year stretched out before you, each day carrying a portion of a story that began long before anything familiar existed. And within that year, the entire Paleogene unfolds, from its first moment to its last. If those 43 million years were compressed into that single year, the arrival of modern humans would not come in spring or summer, nor even in autumn, but in the final hour of the final day. The appearance of our species would fall within the last 37 minutes before midnight on December 31st, a brief interval at the edge of a long unfolding, all of recorded history, every written word, every carved monument, every remembered name, would be contained within the final 90 seconds of that year, a thin line drawn at the very end. In that scale, the greater part of the narrative lies elsewhere. The long intervals described earlier, the shifting climates, the emergence and disappearance of entire lineages occupy nearly the entire calendar. Human experience, so detailed and immediate from within, becomes a fleeting addition when placed against that wider frame. The sense of distance often associated with ancient life begins to dissolve, replaced by an awareness that most of the story exists outside the narrow window we inhabit. The beings that filled those earlier chapters were not incomplete versions of anything that would follow. Each was a finished expression of its own moment, shaped precisely to the conditions in which it lived. Their bodies carried solutions refined through countless generations, their behaviors tuned to environments that no longer exist. They moved through landscapes that were as tangible and complex as any present scene, interacting with one another in ways that formed complete and functioning worlds. Across vast stretches of time, creatures such as the large predatory birds that once occupied southern continents lived through cycles that repeated day after day, season after season. Their nervous systems received signals, processed movement and sound, guided action, and maintained the continuity of life across millions of years. The details of those experiences differ from anything familiar, yet they were real in the same immediate sense that any living system encounters its surroundings. The recognition of this scale did not emerge easily. When early geologists began to understand the age of the Earth, the implications extended far beyond measurements of rock and sediment. In the late 18th century, the Scottish thinker James Hutton described a past with no visible beginning and a future with no clear end, a perspective that shifted the human sense of place within time itself. The realization introduced a form of depth that resisted ordinary intuition, expanding the backdrop against which all events occur. Within that expanded frame, the Paleogene becomes not a distant curiosity, but a substantial portion of an ongoing continuum. Its duration, when translated into familiar units, reveals a scale that exceeds everyday perception, yet remains grounded in the same physical processes that operate now. Erosion, sedimentation, evolution, and climate continue to act, extending patterns that began long before any observer could record them. Seen in this way, the present moment occupies a narrow boundary between what has already unfolded and what will continue beyond it. The long passage from the early Paleogene to now is not separated from current experience, but connected through an unbroken sequence of change. The calendar closes its final seconds with quiet continuity, carrying forward a story that has always extended far beyond the limits of immediate awareness. Before any name could be given to our species, before language or memory could gather into anything lasting, the outlines of what a human body would become were already taking shape in a very different world. The eyes that face forward, aligning their fields of view into a single image, carry a history that reaches back to early primates moving through layered vegetation. Depth perception was not an abstract advantage, but a necessity measured in precise movements from one support to another. Each successful reach reinforced neural pathways that judged distance and angle with increasing accuracy. And over countless generations, this capacity settled into the structure of the skull itself, placing the eyes side by side in a configuration that still defines how space is perceived. The hand followed a parallel refinement, not as a toolmaker at first, but as a structure for holding and stabilizing. fingers capable of closing around irregular surfaces, guided by a thumb that could meet them with controlled pressure, allowed for secure contact in complex environments. Flat nails replaced claws, increasing sensitivity at the tips, turning the hand into an instrument of touch as much as grip. The movements now used to write, build, or lift are extensions of patterns that began as simple acts of holding. Within the skull, changes unfolded at a quieter pace. Brain size, relative to the body, increased gradually in those same early lineages. This growth did not begin with language or planning as they are now understood, but with subtle expansions in sensory processing and coordination. Circuits that integrated vision, balance, and motion became more intricate, laying a foundation upon which later complexity would build. The architecture present in modern humans carries this layered history, each addition resting upon earlier arrangements that were shaped long before any reflective thought emerged. There are traces that extend beyond structure into response. The rapid recognition of certain shapes, particularly those resembling coiled or elongated forms, appears to be embedded within primate visual systems. This sensitivity aligns with a long association between early mammals and a group of predators that expanded during the same broad interval. The speed of that recognition suggests a deep origin, a refinement carried forward through generations that encountered similar threats. Even the rhythm that governs wakefulness and rest holds a connection to those earlier conditions. Activity cycles, tuned to the presence or absence of light, were established when survival depended on moving at times that reduced exposure to danger. The alternating pattern of alertness and quiet, still present in daily life, reflects an inheritance from ancestors whose existence was closely bound to the cycle of day and night. These elements do not appear as isolated features. They operate together, forming a coherent system that has been assembled over an immense span of time. When a hand closes around an object, guided by vision that estimates distance with precision, supported by neural processes that coordinate motion, the action is not newly created. It is the continuation of a sequence that began in environments far removed from anything familiar. In this sense, the present body is not separate from that earlier world, but continuous with it. The Paleogene does not stand apart as a distant chapter that has ended. Its influence remains active, expressed through structures and patterns that persist within every movement and perception. The lineage that leads to humans did not simply pass through that time. It was shaped there, assembled piece by piece, until the form now recognized emerged from processes that never truly stopped. Across the long span just traced, absence begins to speak as clearly as presence, forming a quiet catalog of lives that once defined entire landscapes and now persist only as impressions in stone. Names that once belonged to dominant forms move through the record like silhouettes. Uintatherium, with its heavy skull and clustered protrusions, Coryphodon, occupying wet lowlands with steady persistence, the broader Dinocerata exploring body plans that no longer exist. Brontothers, immense and deliberate, shaped the structure of their environments for millions of years, while creodont predators maintained balance within those systems through strength and specialization. Mesonychids moved with a different design entirely, and the varied condylarths filled roles that would later be taken by more familiar lineages. Each group, distinct in form and function, occupied a position that seemed secure within its own moment. Their disappearance was not the result of simple inadequacy. For extended intervals, these animals were entirely successful, integrated into the fabric of their surroundings with a precision that allowed them to persist and diversify. They fed, reproduced, and maintained stable populations across changing seasons and shifting geographies. Their anatomies were not flawed within the conditions they inhabited. Instead, those conditions themselves moved beyond the range to which these forms were adapted. As climates shifted toward cooler and more variable states, especially during the transition between the Eocene and the Oligocene, the environments that had supported these lineages began to contract or transform. Forests thinned, seasonal patterns intensified, and resources that had once been predictable became less so. For animals whose bodies and behaviors were closely tied to stable, resource-rich conditions, these changes introduced pressures that could not be met quickly enough. Evolution operates across generations, adjusting gradually, while environmental change can alter the stage more rapidly than those adjustments can accumulate. In this contrast lies a central pattern. Dominance within a stable context does not confer protection against transformation. Complexity, while effective under specific conditions, can become a constraint when those conditions shift. What persists is not necessarily what is largest or most specialized, but what can adjust within the window of change that opens and closes without warning. Adaptability, expressed through flexibility in diet, behavior, or habitat, becomes the factor that allows continuity. This pattern extends beyond the Paleogene, forming a broader principle that continues to shape life. Every species occupies a range of conditions within which its biology functions effectively. A balance of temperature, moisture, and resource availability that supports its processes. When those parameters move beyond certain limits, the systems built upon them begin to strain. The edges of that range are not always visible from within, yet they define the boundaries of persistence. For the animals that vanished, there was no indication of finality in their daily existence. They continued to move through their environments, responding to immediate demands, maintaining their roles within ecosystems that still functioned, even as underlying conditions shifted. The transition from stability to absence did not occur as a single moment, but as a gradual narrowing of possibilities until continuation was no longer possible. What remains is not only the record of what endured, but also the outline of what did not. These lost lineages contribute to an understanding of how life responds to change, revealing that success is tied to context rather than permanence. Their presence, now reduced to fragments and traces, marks a series of completed paths, each one fully realized within its time, and each one ending when the conditions that supported it moved beyond reach. In the first quiet that followed the impact, beneath soil that still held the memory of heat, a small body remained still, its world reduced to narrow passages and brief movements, sustained by whatever could be found within reach. That creature did not recognize its moment as a threshold. It had no awareness of what had ended or what might begin. Its existence was defined by immediate demands, the search for food, the avoidance of exposure, the continuation of a cycle that had always been local and immediate. Yet, within that narrow frame, something essential persisted, a lineage carrying traits that had allowed survival through conditions that removed so much else. Time moved forward without intention, and the surface above changed in ways that gradually altered the pressures shaping life. The absence of former constraints allowed new patterns to emerge, not through planning, but through the accumulation of variation across generations. From that small beginning, populations expanded into spaces that had been unavailable, exploring forms and behaviors that had not previously been sustained. Across tens of millions of years, Those early survivors gave rise to a widening array of descendants. Some entered the water and refined bodies suited to movement through dense fluid. Others took to the air, shaping limbs into structures that could generate lift and control. Many remained on land, diversifying into forms adapted to forests, wetlands, and later, more open environments. Each lineage followed its own path, yet all shared a connection that traced back to that earlier moment of persistence. Among these branches, one continued to develop characteristics that had begun in the Paleogene: refined sensory systems, dexterous limbs, and increasing neural complexity. Within that lineage, behaviors expanded to include new forms of interaction with surroundings, eventually leading to a capacity for reflection. At some point, one group began to consider its own origins, turning attention toward the past that had shaped it. Understanding that past required tools and methods that did not exist within the earlier world itself. Layers of rock were examined, fossils compared, chemical signatures analyzed, and genetic relationships traced. Fields of study emerged gradually, each contributing a portion of the larger picture. Discoveries from arid landscapes, coastal deposits, and polar regions added detail, revealing connections that had once been hidden. The outline that has emerged shows continuity rather than abrupt separation. What appeared as an ending at one scale becomes, when viewed across longer intervals, a transition into new forms of organization. The conditions following the impact did not produce emptiness, but a field in which different possibilities could be realized. Over time, those possibilities were explored, refined, and either maintained or set aside. The Paleogene, in this context, is not a distant interval detached from the present. It forms a structural base upon which later developments depend. The systems that define current ecosystems, the relationships among major groups of organisms, and the physical processes that shape environments all carry elements established during that span. What exists now is connected directly to those earlier configurations. The story continues without a clear boundary separating past from present. The processes that operated then remain active, guiding change through the same mechanisms of variation and selection. The initial conditions have shifted, but the underlying patterns persist, extending forward from a moment when survival was limited to small, hidden forms, into a present where those forms have diversified into a complex and interconnected world. Night returns without announcement, settling over a landscape that has only recently remembered how to grow. The ground, once layered with ash, now carries a thin green texture, delicate structures rising where almost nothing stood before. In the dimness, small forms move with measured caution, pausing between each step as if the world itself might still shift beneath them. There is no guide for what follows. Each movement is a response to immediate conditions, shaped by instincts that have never needed to consider a future beyond the next moment. Yet, across countless repetitions, those small decisions accumulate, forming paths that extend far beyond the awareness of the creatures making them. What begins as simple survival becomes, over vast stretches of time, a process that reshapes the entire living surface of the planet. From that quiet beginning, an unfolding takes place that does not repeat itself elsewhere in Earth's long history. Over 43 million years, life explores possibilities with a steady patience, refining structures, altering behaviors, and occupying spaces that had once been unreachable. Forms appear that would have been impossible to imagine from the perspective of those first survivors, each one fitted precisely to the conditions of its moment, each one temporary within a larger sequence. The continuity between those early movements and the present is neither obvious nor direct, yet it remains unbroken. Every branch that persisted did so through a series of events that could easily have resolved differently. Slight changes in circumstance would have redirected entire lineages, altering outcomes that now seem fixed only because they have already occurred. The path that leads from that dim landscape to the present is not a wide road, but a narrow thread sustained across immense time. Within that thread are countless instances of endurance, organisms that continued through conditions that limited resources, through shifts in temperature and terrain, through moments when continuation depended on small advantages that could not be predicted or preserved. Some crossed distances without clear direction, carried by processes larger than themselves. Others remained in place, adapting gradually as their surroundings changed in ways that demanded new responses. What exists now is the accumulation of those continuities. The living world carries structures that were assembled long before there was any awareness of them, patterns of interaction that have been tested repeatedly under different conditions. The environment itself reflects those processes, shaped by organisms, even as it shapes them in return. The result is not a finished system, but one that continues to adjust, maintaining coherence through ongoing change. The interval in which those foundations were established has ended, yet its influence remains present in every aspect of the current world. The organisms that lived during that span are no longer here, but the frameworks they contributed to persist, supporting forms that would have been impossible without them. What seems stable now is supported by layers of prior transformation, each one necessary for what followed. As the night deepens, the small movements continue, quiet and unobserved, part of a pattern that extends across time without interruption. The conditions are different, the forms are different, yet the underlying process remains familiar in its rhythm. From that first cautious emergence into a silent landscape to the present moment, the continuity has held, carrying forward a world that was built gradually, without plan and without pause. Rest comes naturally within such continuity, as part of the same cycle that has always governed life's movement through darkness and light.